Okay. Welcome everyone to Strait Science. Strait Science is a evening seminar series put on by UAF Northwest Campus and UAF Alaska Sea Grant. We both UAF Alaska Sea Grant and UAF Northwest Campus, we are public servants of the Bering Strait region. And we serve the Bering Strait region, which is the homeland and waters of the Inupiaq, Yupik, and St. Lawrence Island Yupik peoples. And tonight, which happens to be the 20th of July, it is pouring rain outside and has been basically all day. So I think tonight we're going to find out. If I had to put money on whether it's going to be a wetter or drier future, I think I'm going to go towards wet. But we'll wait to see what our speakers have to tell us. Our speakers tonight are Bob Bolton, who's a permafrost hydrologist at the University of Alaska Fairbanks International Arctic Research Center, and also Katrina Bennett is a hydrologist at the Los Alamos National Laboratory, and Katrina's on a 2-hour time difference. So hats off to Katrina. With that, I think we'll just let you guys get going on this. And Bob Bolton, I guess you're speaking first.
Yeah, I'll let Katrina introduce herself and then I'll go from there.
All right, and you got your slide. There you go. All right, thank you so much. Take it away.
Okay, hi. Yeah, my name is Katrina Bennett. I am just trying to do one thing with getting out of this. Sorry. Yeah, so I'm a scientist that studies water and climate change impacts at the Los Alamos National Laboratory. And tonight I'm coming to you from Santa Fe, New Mexico, the land of the northern and southern Tiwa. I recognize that this land is one piece of a larger boundless terrain for indigenous peoples that includes the Nome Pueblo, the Tiwa, the Jicarilla Apache, the Diné, the Navajo, Cochiti, Taos, and Hopi Pueblos. So yeah, I'm going to turn it over to Bob Bolton to introduce himself and then start off the talk.
Great, thank you. My name is, I'm unmuted. I'm Bob Bolton, as Gabe mentioned. I'm a permafrost hydrologist, and I'm at the University of Alaska Fairbanks campus, and I'm in the International Arctic Research Center. The University of Alaska Fairbanks campus is located on Trothieta, on the traditional homelands of the Tanana Diné people. And before I begin, I just want to, there's not very many people in this call, but this crowd, this audience is very different than my typical that I speak with. And so if I say something that is unclear or needs more clarification or is too jargony, please stop me and ask me to clarify so we can understand what's going on. And then the other thing is that we would like to thank the Native corporations that support our work and allow us to work on their lands. UIC Science in Utqiagvik, the Bering Straits Native Corporation, the Council Native Corporation, Mary's Igloo Native Corporation, and the Sitnasuk Native Corporation. We appreciate their guidance and for allowing us to conduct our research on their homelands of the Inupiaq people. And so the project that we're going to be talking to you about today is the NG Arctic project. It's a project that's been ongoing since 2012 and is funded by the Department of Energy. It's supporting 4 different national labs: Los Alamos National Lab, where Katrina's at, Oak Ridge National Laboratory, which is in Tennessee, and that's the lead institution. Berkeley National Lab, which is in San Francisco area, and Brookhaven National Lab, which is in New York. And the University of Alaska Fairbanks is also a partner in this project. The overarching goal of this project is to improve Arctic process representation in Earth system models or global climate models. So basically, we're trying to improve permafrost representation in the models and the subsequent impacts of permafrost change on vegetation, on hydrology, how the water moves across the landscape and what that means. over the years, we've had about 100 people from the 4 different labs working on the project since 2012. We're nearing the end of our phase 3 part of this, and that will end in the fall of 2024. So we should be in the region for the remainder of this summer and hopefully next summer, and then maybe into the future from there. And then Gay mentioned that all the talks are on the YouTube, and there have been at least 2 and probably 3 different NG related talks. I know that Carly Arndt gave a talk, and Stan Walschlager gave a talk to this group, and then I believe that Verity Salmon has also given a talk. So everybody has a different role and a different interest, and Katrina and I are the hydrologists, or 2 of the hydrologists on the project. And so in order to solve the NG problem or address the NG problem, we take this in a 2 different folds. And so sort of a MODEX is what we call it, which means model, observation, collaboration. And so we spend a lot of time in the field collecting data. Most of these 2 figures over here are from Ukqiavik, and then we have figures here from that's the Kugarok field site, and then the far Kugarok field site down at the end of the road. So we spend a lot of time in the field collecting data, using instruments, using shovels, using thaw probes, spend a lot of time in the streams, a lot of time in the snow. And we take our measurements and we try to incorporate what we learned from on the ground and at the smaller scale and put those into different models. And over time, we blow up those models from very fine scale or very small scale, almost one-dimensional scale on the ground. And then we take the knowledge from that small scale local base, and we try to build it out a little bit. So this are a couple polygons, ponds in the Ukqiavik region. And if you cluster a bunch of these together, then you get a bigger cluster of these. And as you grow the models, then you have to simplify the models to make it actually computationally available and feasible to run. And then as we blow up to different watersheds, this little thing right here is the Teller watershed out the Teller Road. And so this is the Seneca Basin here. And then we scale up to Alaska. And then eventually we hope to get to the Pan-Arctic or the circumpolar Arctic region. And so that's the goal of our project and what we've been working on for a number of years. The questions that we're asking are looking at changes in the permafrost condition, the health of the permafrost, the thawing of the permafrost, how shrubs are encroaching on the landscape into the tundra regions and what that means to permafrost, and how water moves across the landscape with the changes in permafrost and disturbance like wildfire, the shrub encroachment, those sorts of things. And then we're trying to understand the processes that lead to the changes in the landscape and what happens after those changes take place. And so what's the next step in that process? So the NGR project is organized into 6 basic science discovery questions. They're located here on the bottom. So we have a gradient of topography, of permafrost, vegetation, and hydrology. We have questions that are looking at the landscape, meaning what does the landscape look like with the permafrost thaw, the ponds. The biogeochemistry is focused on what happens with the carbon that's in the soils or the organics, whether or not it moves into methane or carbon dioxide gases, which are both greenhouse gases. We're looking at plant traits and how the plants respond to changes in climate, to temperature, changes in temperature, different plants that may be encroaching on the landscape. As I mentioned, looking at changes in shrubs and how shrubby the Arctic is becoming. And then changes in hydrology, which is what Katrina and I are focusing on. And so this is looking at the question of whether the landscape gets wetter or drier if permafrost degrades. And we don't have a good answer to that because it depends a lot on a lot of things. You know, if you're in a valley bottom or how icy the ground is, So it depends. And then we've recently started talking about and looking at questions of disturbance. And with that, we're looking at thermal karst and slumps, as well as wildfires, tundra wildfires.
Okay, I'll bite. What's thermal karst?
Oh, good question. Sorry. So, thermal karst is depressions in the landscape caused by the melting of ice that's in the ground. And so as the ice melts in the ground due to climate change or rain or a wildfire, that the ice melts and moves to the surface and the ground collapses essentially. And so you end up with these depressions, and these depressions can connect, and so you can end up with bigger ponds, or you can have drainage out of these collapses. And so, yeah, thank you, Gay, for.
And I had one other question already, and that is, I saw the diagram, and it had CO2 and CH4.
Yeah.
I
So
get carbon dioxide, but what's
methane. The other one is
methane?
methane.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thanks for the questions. And so here's an example of the different landscapes that we're working in. These two up here are in Ukiavik. This is Ukiavik as well. This is our Teller watershed next to the top of the Teller watershed, which is near the Seneca River. When you take that big right-hand turn by the Seneca, you go up the hill, and we're located there. We do a lot of work in the Kugarok Road. This is at mile 64, which is just north of Pilgrim Hot Springs. There's a little hill there, and we have a number of sites and doing work out there. And this is that same site in the fall. It's beautiful out there. And then we also do a lot of work out in council. And the council work has been ongoing from many years with Larry Hensman started there, Copre's out there, and there's a number of different groups, but we've been working out there since 2015 or 2016 as well. And so, as I mentioned, we have our field sites. We have two field sites on the Teller Road. We have one here at mile 27 near the Seneca River, and then we have another one up here near mile 47, and I cannot remember the name of that river that's up there, but it's near the new graphite mine. It's just to the south of the new graphite mine, I believe, that's going in on that road up there. We have two sites out the Kugarok Road, one at mile 64 that I was just describing, and then we're doing a lot of new work, disturbance work at the very end of the Kugarok Road at Quartz Creek, where there's been a number of wildfires over the years. And so we're doing vegetation studies, looking at how much the ground is subsiding with the melting of the ice in the ground and just depressing the ground. And it's been pretty interesting. And then we have our third site out at the end of the council road, near where all those other sites that I was just describing. And so this picture kind of represents the work that is pretty fundamental to what I think about and what I believe that Katrina thinks about. And so this is thermal karst. This used to be a landscape that was relatively flat. The ice melted and caused a depression. And so I'm interested in, and we're interested in, understanding why this landscape changes, how this landscape changes, why it changes in the places that it changes, and then what happens after that. And so in this case, it might have looked like this or this beforehand, but afterwards it looks a lot drier. We have a lot of water down here. We have different plants down here than we have on the surface. So we're interested in these types of questions. What happens? Why does it happen? What happens when it happens? And then what are the downstream impacts? And then on top of that, so we do all this field-based measurements and experimentation and observations. And then we try to take our understanding from that and build it back into the models at the different scales. And Katrina will talk a lot about the modeling work that we're doing sort of in this. And so we look at stream flow, we look at soil moisture, we look at snow in terms of the water movement and distribution across the landscape. But even though it's basic science, I call it basic science, fundamental science, there are good reasons for downstream understanding of these processes. A wetter or drier climate will have impacts on berries. There's no doubt about that, and the vegetation and ecosystems on the landscapes. It has implications. The permafrost health has implications for infrastructure. So here we have a house that's sunk into the ground because there was too much heat, more heat in the house than in the ground, and the ground subsided with the melting of the ice. Here's a road in Bethel that's falling apart. This is 1 year after they put the road in, and they disturbed the land surface, and the permafrost wasn't healthy enough to support the road. So you have this big wavy road, a very expensive road that isn't as functional as they were once hoping. It also changes foraging and the health and habitats of different creatures out there. So we observed a lot of ice in the snow this last year, and that impacts foraging of caribou, that impacts foraging of moose, that impacts foraging of these muskox, and then the habitats change for birds as well. This bird likes very wet and it doesn't do well in the dry, but this bird might move in and be dry. So the changes in habitat are also quite important. And then finally, like Katrina was talking about at the beginning or right before we started, the permafrost and the permafrost health is quite important for fish habitat, as that controls in part the temperature. We get more shrubs along the banks that will shade the streams, that might cool the streams. There might be sediments that are being dumped into the streams from the permafrost degrading, which could impact the fish health and fish migration and habitat. And so even though we're doing fundamental science and trying to build better models and do better models, there's very good applications and relevant applications that are important for everybody in society in general. It's all quite important for lots of different reasons and for lots of different interests. And so with that, this is my take-home message with all of my talks, is that everything is completely connected. You can't change the climate without changing the vegetation. You can't change the vegetation without changing the climate or permafrost or the hydrology. If you change a bit of the hydrology, the snow or the water distribution, you completely change the ecology, you completely change the permafrost, and you definitely impact the climate. And so when we talk about these things, we talk about them separately, but it's important to realize that even though they're separate, they're all very, very much related and very, it's a push and pull sort of thing. And so that's my take home message if nothing else comes across tonight. So we'll just start with the basic definition of permafrost, because we're not talking about fish. Permafrost is any ground that remains frozen below 32 degrees Fahrenheit for 2 or more years consecutively. It can be any combination of rock, it can be soil and ice. It just has to be frozen. And it's quite important. There's 24% of the land, ice-free land area is underlined by permafrost in the northern hemisphere. The blue circle up here is Alaska circled here, and the Seward Peninsula is out here. The Seward Peninsula is in the zone of discontinuous permafrost, which means that there's not permafrost everywhere. There's some areas that do have permafrost, and there are some areas that do not have permafrost. And what happens in those different areas is very, very different in terms of the vegetation, in terms of the hydrology, etc. But the permafrost in the area in the Seward Peninsula is quite warm. It's very close to the freezing temperature. And once you flip over and melt the ice, it's very, very, very difficult to go backwards and reestablish. And so once you flip the switch and melt the ice, it's very hard to move forward, and you sort of end up with these cascading results, like the ground subsiding or your roads falling apart, or the vegetation changing, or the berries doing something different than you expect from 1 year to the next. And so we do a lot of field observation, data analysis, and computer modeling with our work between Katrina and myself, but then as the NG team itself. And I'll just go through a quick example of something that I'm thinking about and have been thinking about in this area. And so when I look at this picture, that we showed earlier, you see that the ground has subsided. It's different than the historically, what I would assume is a non-thermal karsted area. And we know that thermal karst, or this melting of the ground ice and the collapse of the soil structure, occurs, and it occurs in a lot of places, but it doesn't occur everywhere ubiquitous. It doesn't occur everywhere all the time. And so there's some places where it occurs and they're adjacent, it might not occur, and from one year it may occur and next year it may not occur, or that process. And so one thing that we've been thinking about is why in time, where in space, on the landscape, and in time does thermal karst occur, and how does it initiate if all the landscape is susceptible or could thaw, the ice could melt and the landscape subside. And so one thing that we've been thinking about is what are the conditions that might lead to permafrost health, or making a not as healthy permafrost or cold permafrost. And so if you have a very warm summer, that certainly wouldn't help permafrost. If you have, so you have summer and you warm up the ground, but then if you follow up that warm ground and warm summer with an early and deep snowpack, that would trap the heat. The snow is a great insulator, and that would trap the heat under the ground and keep the ground warmer over a longer period of time. If you have a very warm winter, that would also be favorable to permafrost health, or favorable to permafrost degradation, in terms of you don't have as much cold going into the ground through that insulating layer. And then if you follow that up with a very warm summer the next year, there's a chance that you might start degrading that permafrost in space and time. And so what we started doing is we took all these different factors and started just sort of lining them up. And so this is a hypothetical where zeros, or these are like close to average conditions. The pluses mean that you're above average, and the negatives mean that you're below average. And so if we're looking at summer temperature, last year's summer temperature, if we, let's say it was like year 2 and it's pretty warm, above average, 2 pluses. There was an early snowfall. There was a total snowfall that was deeper than normal, much deeper than normal. The winter temperature was much normaler. And if you add all these up, then you might end up with what I'm calling a climate priming. You prime the landscape for this thawing of the ground. You can also have the exact opposite conditions so this would be bad for the permafrost health. But you can have the exact opposite, where you have a very, very cold summer. You have no snow, there's no insulation on the ground, and so there's lots of cold pounding into the surface. It might be a little bit above average in the wintertime, but not much. And the next summer might be, just sort of an average summer. But if you add all these things up, then you might end up with a condition that really reinforces or re-hardens the permafrost condition. And so what we've done is we've looked at all of the North Slope and all of Western Alaska, and we've looked at the summer temperatures for every month of every year from 1902 through 2020 at this point. And we basically scale from 0 to 1, with the very coldest summer temperatures at the very low end of 0, and then at the very high end it's equal to 1. And then we do the same thing with winter temperatures, what we've defined as October to April at this point. And so the very coldest winters get a 0, and the very warmest temperatures get a 1. Same with snow, total snow. And then we also do rain and monthly rain. And then we add all these things up. So we add up summer temperature, winter temperature, the snow conditions, the precipitation conditions, and then we get this climate priming index, which goes from 0, which means very cold permafrost or rehardening or reinforcing the permafrost, to 6, which is sort of bad conditions for permafrost. And permafrost might be degrading in those places. And so here's a quick example of that. So 1902 to 1920, you can see that almost all of the colors are blue or dark blue, meaning that permafrost is cold, the ground is cold in sequence. In 1912, there was a little bit of warmth, not a lot, but some warmth in this area in Seward Peninsula, again in 1916, but generally pretty blue. But if we look at the last handful of years, 2001 through 2020, you see a lot more red, very red in 2020, very red and dark red in 2018, and so on. So you can see there's a significant shift between early 1900s to where we are today in current form. And I have plots of all of these for every decade, and you can definitely see the change in colors as you move forward to the present time now. And so I boxed out 2018 and 2019 here, and I just want to show one plot where we actually did have these conditions on the Seward Peninsula on the Cougar Rock Road, where we had very, very warm summers. We had very deep snow. We had a very warm winter. And the following year here in 2018, a lot of our permafrost sites didn't completely freeze. And so this is to the winter of 2016, 2017. This is ground temperature going from the surface to about 4 feet underground. And you can see that in all of our sensors, they froze. They went below freezing during that time. And then in summertime, they warmed up again to very warm. But you can see that this freezing line here, it got to 0, but it didn't completely freeze. The water in the soil did not freeze. And then it warmed up again. And this again, the same process, the exact same conditions happened again in 2019, where our sites didn't refreeze again. And so I think we're going to see some thermal karst, some degradation of the permafrost in these sites. And so this site is out by the Cougar Rock Road, the mile 64, but we also saw this in our Teller mile 27 near the Cynic River. And then this is definitely happening in the council area too. All 3 of our sites that we monitor the temperature, this happened during that time period. And with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Katrina.
Yeah, thanks so much, Bob. Can you hear me okay? Okay, yeah, so I want to talk a little bit about changing gears a bit to talk a little bit about the snow, and Bob kind of outlined a little bit about what I'm talking about. So one of the main ways that we're looking at landscape variability in the NG Arctic project is really to try to understand how the snow and vegetation and permafrost all interact. And how we're focusing on that variability is sort of, we're looking at the landscapes that we have, and observing the landscapes in different ways, measuring the snowpack and measuring the variability across the snow so that we could better understand it. And so the image on the left-hand side kind of shows the variability that we see in topography across the Seward Peninsula, and that photo was actually taken from a helicopter flying out to the Cougar Rock study site that Bob showed earlier, whereas the image in the middle illustrates the patterns that we see in the snowpack that are influenced by where the shrubs are growing. And so you can see these sort of different shapes and different depths of snowpack and different patterns in the snow that are all formed by the shrubs and where they're located in the landscape. And then the image on the right-hand side shows the snow measurements that we took out in 2018 at that Cougar Rock study site, and where the colors, the darker purple colors represent the deeper snowpack, and the lighter colors, the greens and the yellows and things like that, represent sort of more shallow snow. And so this actually is really indicative of the landscape and also where the shrubs are located in the area at the top of the dome, and not the very top, but around the edges of the dome where the shrubs are growing. And so those shrubs tend to capture that snowpack, and the wind blows it into the hollows and the topographic features across this dome, and it piles up, and it's deeper in those areas. So next slide, please, Bob. So I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about sort of where these study sites are and show you a couple of images from that. So the first the left-hand side of the slide just shows the 3 main roads, of course, out of Nome, Alaska that Bob showed in earlier. The Teller and the Kugarok Road is where we are studying the snowpack in particular. So we're not actually looking at the study sites out of council for this part of our work. So the middle image there shows the Kugarok. So we call this a dome. It's a 2.5 square kilometer dome, and it's got a windswept rocky top, about 110 meters elevation. So it's not very high, but you can see all the patterns around kind of where the water tracks are actually running down that dome. And we also can see the darker green patches where the shrubs are growing along the sort of edges of the top of the dome there. And you can also see the road going through the right-hand side of the study site. So our second site that I'm going to talk a little bit about is the Teller Watershed site. So this is located along the Teller Road at mile 27. It's a 2.3 square kilometer peak plateau, and its elevation is about 300 meters at the top, so it's a little higher, but it is a watershed. So there's a stream that drains through at the center of this. And so you can actually see in this image here all these different permafrost features where the permafrost is actually starting to degrade. And so it's actually starting to thaw at various locations throughout the watershed. And we're also seeing, we have a lot of variability in terms of shrubs. So we see tall willows at sort of the center, mid elevation, and we have some wet meadows at the bottom of the watershed. And so we collected data across three years at Teller, 2017, 2018, and 2019. And at Kugarok, we were only able to get out there in 2018. And we actually did go to both sites this last spring too. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that towards the end of my talk today. So if you could go to the next slide, Bob. This next slide just shows, I think it's going to move to the next, oops. Slide pretty soon. I don't know, it's not advancing. Oh, there we go. Okay. So here we can see a whole bunch of different images of us taking those measurements of the snowpack. And so we do have quite a lot of fun out in the field. You know, we can see in the upper left-hand corner, I'm shoveling the snow to get down to the bottom of that snow core, which Bob Busey, one of our UAF researchers who helps us out on the project a lot, he's taking the snow core. So that's that instrument that he's emptying the snow into the bag is where he's collecting the snow to weigh it, and then we can understand how much water is held in the snowpack. And then Lauren in the middle of the slide and myself on the right-hand side, we are measuring the snowpack with something that we call a Magnetoprobe. So we're actually measuring how deep the snow is using this instrument. And then we can relate that to the amount of water that's held in the snowpack. And we also measure the snow temperature. So we take the temperature at the bottom of the snowpack too. So if you can go to the next slide. So just waiting for the slide to change on my end here. I'm not sure if it's not changing on your end, but yeah, so I think one of the things that we're really interested to understand is that we know that the snow is highly affected by the topography, and you can see this in the image on the right-hand slide, and we also know that it's really affected by shrubs. So, sorry, for some reason this keeps changing on me here. Yeah, so I guess what happens is the snow is captured by the shrubs, and then it's deeper in around the shrubs and in topographic hollows and holes that are formed by permafrost, thaw slumps, and also along things like the stream banks, which are running through the edge of or in the middle of Teller. And so this snow, when it gets deeper, it actually, as Bob kind of mentioned earlier, it blankets the permafrost, or it protects the permafrost. from the very cold temperatures that you get out on the Seward Peninsula at these study sites. And so what we see is just more, as the snowpack is deeper, we actually get warmer permafrost happening, and then we can get permafrost thawing. And so, but on the other hand, if we have thinner snow in the areas not around the shrubs or not in those topographic hollows, then we get more cold permafrost occurring, and that just means that we end up preserving the permafrost. And so this is something that we're really just trying to understand how the shrubs, the vegetation, the topography all interact together to protect the permafrost and or warm it up and lead to its thaw. So yeah, this is something that the project is just really interested in doing, and we've been setting up all of these different ways to capture the data, to analyze the information, and then make different types of simulations so we can better understand it. Yeah, so just if you want to go to the next slide, Bob.
Yep. It's advanced.
Sorry, I don't know why it just keeps changing very slowly on my end here. So this next slide, I think that we're going to go to in a minute. Yeah, here we go. Is an image of the 2 study sites and all of the different measurements of snow depth, and also the amount of water that's held in the snowpack or snow water equivalent, and that we've taken over the years at the Teller watershed on the left-hand side and the Cougar Rock Hill Slope on the right-hand side. And so we didn't get out to these study sites in 2021 and 2020, but we were able to go out in 2022. So we were able to visit Nome and both these study sites in May to capture all this information about the snowpack. And so just to go to the next slide, all of this information that we've been collecting out in these locations is going into simple models of the snow distribution. And so we can better understand how the snowpack varies across the landscape, across the topography, and in amongst all of those shrub locations. So we can incorporate that into our regional models of all of the land across the Seward Peninsula, and eventually all of Alaska and all of the Pan-Arctic in the long run. So these maps show these simple models that we've been developing to look at snow distribution at the Teller and Cougar Rock study sites. And so once we develop these models, we can then embed them within our larger simulations, and we'll be able to improve those larger simulations to better predict the future impacts of changing temperature and precipitation. And that will just help us better represent what we see on the ground in terms of the snow distribution in those simulations. So that's going to help us better characterize the Arctic and the subarctic regions, and really get at sort of this wetter or drier question, how the snow depth and how the variability of the snow across these locations, this landscape, is going to impact the permafrost and the ground temperature, both in terms of the water that's held in the snowpack and the depth of snow, and also the energy that's controlled by that water and temperature in the snowpack. So that's kind of our main goal there. And then if you want to go to the next slide, Bob, kind of where we're going next with this work is we have a couple of really exciting projects that we're working on. So on the left-hand side, you can see an image of this Rainfall Simulator. So one of the things that happens is that maybe when we get a lot of snow one year held in those shrubs, or maybe a lot of precipitation falling as snow in the wintertime, followed by a really wet summer, we can get some of those really big impacts of the landscape and on the permafrost that really leads to that kind of cascade of effects that can lead to changes in the berries, changes in to the wildlife, and impacts to things like birds and fish. And so this Rainfall Simulator experiment that we've set up, I'm showing on the left-hand side, we're going to basically rain on the ground at very small plots across the study sites. And we're going to look at how that water moves down through the landscape and how it affects the permafrost at one very small study site, so we can better understand it and also kind of put that information into our simulations to improve them. And then on the right-hand side, what we've been doing over the last couple of years is we put these tiny temperature probes that are shown up in the very top part of the slide. And we also have a couple of different new sensors to look at snow depth. And so all of this, these new sensors, we have over 600 new sensors out of the watershed to capture all of these variation that we see underneath the snowpack in and around those shrubs and in those topographic hollows and permafrost features. And so we're going to be collecting all of this information and looking at it along the hill slope, as we're showing kind of in this image here with elevation, slope, and aspect, so and different vegetation types, so representing that kind of range of variability that we see across both Teller and Kubarak sites. And so that's going to help us better characterize, again, the impacts that those features have on the snow depth and ultimately the permafrost and ultimately the berries and the muskox and the salmon. And so the next slide, I'm just going to talk a little bit about 2022. I think the really interesting thing was when we went out in May to measure the snowpack, we found all of these ice layers throughout the snowpack. And so I'm showing that, that photo on the left-hand side that just shows all of those different ice layers. We saw 4 to 5 different ice layers. And actually what had happened, and I'm sure all of you out in Nome know this very well, is we had some really big snow rain events happen through the winter time. And that is shown in the middle image of a simulation from a computer model that just showed that really big rain event hitting Nome and the region. And so that rain fell on the ground and then caused those ice layers, caused some melting of the snowpack. And that ice really affects wildlife. You know, it can't access the ground, it can't access its food. And, you know, this image of moose taken by Ned Roselle, you know, they are really affected by things like rain on snow events. And so it does really impact also the thermal regime, the depth of the snow, how it insulates the ground. And this is something that we are still really just starting to think about and investigate, but we know that that's a really big impact to the wildlife, but also to people. You know, when you have a frozen ice layer forming across the roads and the rivers and the whole landscape, you know, people are affected as well as wildlife and ecology. So yeah, I think the last slide is just to sort of come back to this idea is that, like, as the climate is changing, it's affecting humans, it's affecting animals and plants, it's affecting the permafrost, the thermokarst, and of course the hydrology in the snow, the water in the rivers, ultimately the rain falling on the landscape. And so, yeah, I think this is something that we just really want to drive home, is that the changes that we're seeing in the hydrology, in the water, in the snowpack, in the rain is really affecting all of the landscape and the people that live on these lands. And so it's really important to kind of understand and think about and capture this data so that we can better simulate what's going to happen as we move ahead into the future. So that's all I have to say. So I'll hand it back to Bob to wrap up this talk. Thanks.
Yeah.
Bob, you're muted.
Yeah, it took me a while to find my button.
Okay.
Sorry about that. And so I just want to give a plug to my podcast, which we're going to fire back up again. The Alaska Voices podcast. So it's a project that me and my colleague Jesse Robertson started about 3 years ago. We had to take a break with COVID because we couldn't record conversations. But the Alaska Voices project is very much in line with the StoryCorps project, which you may or may not be aware of. But basically, we ask people to have conversations with each other for 45 minutes and share stories about their landscape, about what they're seeing, their relationships with people, with the land, with each other, with interests and perspectives, and just have that conversation. And so our website is alaskavoices.org, which is down there. And here's just sort of a sample of the types of conversations that we've had. Sasha here is a scientist, and he was working out in a community on the YK Delta, and just his partner with that, and talking about the science and his relationship with the community when he's going out fishing. You know, people asked him to go fishing, and nobody thought he would go out, but he pulled out, you know, a fishing rod out of his pocket that was all foldable and collapsible, and he went fishing, and it made, you know, it built trust with the community and the work that he was doing. We've had elders talk, Orville and Wilson talk. We've had a fire scientist and a fire manager speak. We've gone into the pioneer home and recorded elders, people that have been in Alaska for a long time. This is the chancellor of the university here. He was an engineering professor, and here he's talking with the engineering student. This is the other partner in the Alaska Voices project, and this is talking with our first student and his experiences. And he's from Ethiopia and how he ended up in Alaska. And so here's Victor he's down in, I believe, the YK Delta, and Ryan Tui, who's a hydrologist, and talking about their relationships and stuff. But anyway, I'm happy to talk more about this at a different time, but I did want to share that I'll be in the Nome area from the middle of August for about 8 days, and then the first week in October. And if there's anybody that's interested in learning more about this project, or actually recording a conversation with a friend or a colleague or a sibling or just a colleague, I'd be more than happy to record those conversations. And with that, I will thank our sponsor, the Department of Energy, and open it up for any questions that anybody may have.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Katrina and Bob. That was very interesting for me. And Charlie Lean already has his hand up, so go ahead, Charlie.
Hey, it was really thought-provoking, and I thank you for the report. I hope I'm coming through. I'm a long way from Nome right now.
Yeah.
5 by 5.
Okay, so it seems to me that soil would be a big driver. So like on a rocky hilltop, you know, there's very little soil to accumulate water or to create thermal karst or solifluction, whatever. And then as we've seen sampling for construction near Nome, and what they found was like the top 12-15 feet was far more saturated with water or ice than that the soils below. So when that top surface melts, then the surface really subsides. But then if it continues to decay, the permafrost, there seems to be less obvious impacts. Do you have any comments there?
Do you want to go, Katrina, or do you want me to go?
Yeah, why don't you go?
And so what I think is happening, at least in part, is that because you're in the zone of discontinuous permafrost, just like Fairbanks where I am here, the permafrost layer is actually quite thin. And so once you penetrate through that permafrost, they're called talics, where you have like a hole in the permafrost, that allows water to actually drain through the soils and actually dry out the soils once you get deeper into the subsurface. That would be my first guess without really looking, but I think you're just going through the permafrost layer and getting to deeper grounds which are thawed out already, and you're allowing the water to drain through the deeper ground soils and away, and drying out the ground, as opposed to the upper parts which are holding the permafrost, holds the water close to the surface.
So just to follow on that, the port hired a consultant to drill the uplands between the airport and the beach, and that land is 50 feet above sea level, and they found 20 some feet of permafrost, and what they found was the upper 12 feet had about 50% ice, and the lower portion had less than a third ice, just in a core sample.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's just variable. I think that permafrost holds water near the surface and sort of traps it. And so that would lead to more ice if it freezes near the surface. Again, but it's highly variable across the landscape in general. The ice content is sort of
Yeah.
the million-dollar question, is like, where's the ice in the ground? And if we knew that answer, we'd be a lot further along.
Yeah, one thing just I'll share is that another researcher in NG Arctic at Baptiste Daflon, went out actually this spring and they did a whole bunch of drilling down through the permafrost to really look specifically at this, where the ice layers were and how deep the permafrost specifically was. And so I think we're going to learn a lot of really, really cool information about the permafrost at Teller from those studies that they've done this past spring. So yeah, it's something that I think the project is really actively thinking about and trying to understand better. And Baptiste is actually also going to be out with me in September, so we'll be coming back out to the site, and yeah, we're very happy to talk more if you ever want to, Charlie.
Thank you.
It looks like they're coming this way, so that's good. And I appreciate kind of the heads up when you're going to be in town, because I think that is, I think people do maybe want to, somehow talk with you. Any questions? I know I've got some questions. Any other questions first, though? Throw it open there. I see Austin and Dan. Dan is texting. He's having trouble with his chat. He doesn't know why. Can't see a problem here.
Should I stop sharing? Or keep it up? Should I stop sharing? Okay.
Yeah, sure. Then we can see you bigger. There you go.
Thank you.
That's great. So my question is, how do you make, what is permafrost? You got me thinking about, I don't really think about permafrost too much, but when you said you rehardened it, so where do you get permafrost? How does that, what's that? Where's that come from?
And so permafrost is frozen ground, right? Anything below freezing. But as you get closer to the melting point or the freeze thaw point, it becomes unstable. And so it doesn't, so if you have very, very cold permafrost, you can bang on it, and you can walk on it, you can do all sorts of things to it, and it won't subside because it's just healthier. But as you get closer to that freeze thaw point, once you start banging on it or walking on it or putting roads across it, then it just doesn't, the change in the energy and the heat that goes in, it doesn't take much to flip it from a solid being ice to a liquid being water. And so that's what I mean by permafrost health. It's like when you get closer to that freeze thaw, that flip point, everything sort of changes and it kind of becomes more, I don't want to say plasticky, but it's kind of plasticky. Plastic is not a great adjective for sure, but it's.
It works here. But
yeah.
My question is, when you say discontinuous, yeah, I see, you can dig down and find permafrost, and you can dig down and not find permafrost. So how is it formed? What is permafrost? Where did it come from? Why is it just not contiguous in some places? Why is it 15 feet in some places? And why is it not present in others? How old is it? Because you said it can rehard.
Yeah.
So is that, what's the origin of permafrost?
And so permafrost itself is just fundamentally a climate thing. And so after the last ice age, or during the last ice age, it was much colder on Earth in general, and the ground froze and in the northern latitudes. And so this is all, it was formed, 10,000 years ago or more. And now we're just getting to the point where the climate and the temperatures are rising, that things are starting to switch. And so things that cause discontinuous permafrost is that we're pretty far south. You're still 65 or close to 65 north, but it's kind of getting towards the edge there. The sea ice is going away, so you get more warmth coming off the oceans that impact that. You get more rain coming off the oceans in the wintertime that didn't used to exist. We're getting more shrubs that Katrina talked about encroaching on the landscape. And those shrubs insulate the permafrost from the cold. And so you have a warmer permafrost than you normally wouldn't have had, 50 or 100 or 200 or 500 or 1,000 years ago. And so all these compounding factors, like I said, everything is connected. You add more vegetation, you're going to have warmer permafrost.
No, but I mean, actually, where did it come from originally? Is it like some giant iceberg and then the dirt covered it up, or what is the origin of permafrost?
Oh, I guess just like cold temperatures. So to form permafrost, you have to have an annual
Okay. I must
annual
be asking it wrong. I don't know.
average. So you have to have zero.
But
Go ahead, Katrina. Sorry.
it's just the ground, like just that the ground is where it's frozen, and it could be rock, it could be soil, it could be organic layer of moss or something. But I mean,
Okay.
yeah, I mean, basically it's just any ground that would be frozen for 2 years or longer is termed
Okay.
permafrost.
And
All
so,
right.
and
So
so,
you see those big ice blocks, that's just a massive condensation of the soil?
like the ice wedges.
Yeah, yeah, sure.
Yeah, and so the ice wedges are formed when it gets really cold, and the soils go into tension because it's cold,
Okay,
and you cause a crack in the soil. And during the snow melt period, the snow water goes into this crack and refreezes because the ground is cold, and the ground is cold from thousands of years of cold temperatures. And that the water, that snow water that was liquid, it freezes, and because ice expands when it's frozen, it builds out a little bit, and then you'll end up the next year, it gets cold at the surface,
go.
there's a
Okay.
crack, and then the snow melt goes down into that crack near that same place, and you expand out just a teeny bit more. And so over thousands and 10,000 years, you can build out these massive
There we go.
blocks of ice into the landscape.
Thank you. For my simple cartoon mind, that is very helpful.
Okay,
Yeah.
sorry it took so long to get there.
No, it's all good. My other question is, you had a couple of maps of the Seward Peninsula where you had data from 1902 to 1920 that looked like this comprehensive coverage of temperatures. And I was just curious, how did that data come to be? Where does that come from?
Katrina might know this answer better. So this is all SNAP data, but I think you've worked a lot with that data.
Is
have you
that
not?
from people's written records or?
There are some early records from that time, but that data in particular, I think, is from some model or simulations that we have that are based on historical climate station data, but extrapolated across Alaska. So Bob has this, and this, yeah, like you said, SNAP generated, like University of Alaska Fairbanks organization, Scenario Network for Arctic Planning, has developed this data from both historical climate records, but also model simulations.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you so much. I was like,
Yeah.
wow, where'd they get that treasure trove of data? But I guess you make your own.
You make it, and you correct for it. And so it's like corrected for like elevation changes in elevation and slope and from the historical data. And it's correct, and it's tested against other sites to make sure it's fairly accurate. It's never perfect, but it's pretty good.
What you got? Yep.
That's what we got.
Thank you. Charlie, your hand's still up. Do you have another one, or anyone else have a question for Bob Bolton or Katrina Bennett?
No, sorry.
That's okay. No, it's okay.
Worries.
Because I have one last question. Is it going to be wetter or drier? Oh, Austin, I got you. I see you, Austin. Wetter or drier? If you had to put money on it, what do you see right now?
I'll let Katrina say.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it depends, I think it really depends on where you're looking. And, we do see this huge variability across the landscape, and it depends on sort of when you're looking at that very local scale. And if you're looking in those shrubs that are getting, encroaching on the landscape and holding more snow, and we are seeing those calyx that Bob talked about, those windows through the permafrost getting larger and more water moving through them, and that is all leading to sort of a faster cycle of water and thaw, and sort of speeding up of that system. And so in those areas we're seeing it, that wetter signal. And then, you know, in some areas we're seeing a drier signal. So there's just a lot more variability across the landscape that we're seeing. But, you know, we are, you know, I guess, you know, if we look at what's happening right now in the past several years, we are definitely seeing these sort of deeper snowpacks in specific areas where it's leading to thawing of the permafrost, and then followed by kind of wet summers. And that's where we're really starting to see some of those tipping events that Bob was talking about, where we are getting in that shift in the system. And so that's interesting to see. I think we still need to finish our simulations and kind of look out to the future to really know whether we can answer that question with certainty. But I think we see a lot of variability across the landscape, a lot of these sort of extreme tipping points happening. So it depends.
Austin, your hand is up.
Yeah, thank you. It's always intrigued me, large-scale permafrost because of water's high entropy. You know, humankind is not slowing down greenhouse gas emissions. Do you have any thoughts or opinions on at what point will humankind essentially warm the planet so far that will destroy permafrost in this, you know, in this zone that we're in, this discontinuous zone? Is there any thought or a prevailing thought on at what point we might totally destroy permafrost in this area?
I don't have a good answer for that. And I've never heard anybody. And so there are some simulations, and I didn't show them, that the Geophysical Institute group, permafrost group, have done. And they've done simulations out to 2100. And they've shown on the west coast of sort of northwest Alaska that permafrost largely is disappearing, or there's these talics that we were talking about, these unthawed, unfrozen layers in between the seasonal freeze. So like in the wintertime when the ground freezes down to whatever depth, 3 feet or 4 feet, that there's going to be a layer below that remains unthawed or unfrozen and degrades. And so I would say that there is some modeling work being done by the permafrost group. I can't remember the exact dates, but I kind of want to say mid-ish century if we keep on going in the trajectory that we're going. But I haven't seen, and I wish I could remember the exact dates and the exact locations, but that's kind of what's on my head. And I can look it up and look at their results again too. But yeah, sorry, I don't have a better answer for that.
So mid this century,
Yeah, 2050s, 2060s,
we'll kind of be,
which isn't all that far away.
no.
Yeah,
Austin, any follow-up? Austin, you got any follow-up for Bob, Bolton, or Katrina?
No, thanks. It's just it seems a little scary that humankind is able to impact the planet in such a way that we're changing state of water.
Yeah.
Anyway, think.
Yeah, I agree with that. And like I said before, and like we talked about, everything's sort of connected. And so like the wetter, drier question, if we get more shrubs, that will warm up the permafrost, but then you end up with more, you know, transpiration, which is going to dry out the soils and put moisture back into the atmosphere. And so there's all these different interactions and plays that go on back and forth. And I don't think we have a very good handle on, you know, modeling all those complete and total interactions between all the tiny little things that go on in the ecosystem. And so to say that permafrost is going to disappear, well, there's going to be a whole bunch of other things that are going to occur. Like we're going to have a bunch of more shrubs and a lot more deciduous type of vegetation out there versus the tussock tundra. And what does that mean? I don't know what that means, but I know it's going to be different than what it is. And I don't know how that's going to impact, you know, anything really. You know, these shrubby things are bringing in beavers. There's a bunch of beavers out there that didn't used to exist. What that does to the ecosystem, I don't know, but I know it's going to change it. And so it's kind of it's a weird question to ask. You know, there's like a permafrost modeling, that's just assuming the climate's going to get warmer, but that's not accounting for all the other things that are going on, you know, in parallel with that process. And so it's kind of it's a hard question to answer and be really confident in answering that question. I hope that makes some sense.
All right.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Thanks, Austin. I guess my last question is, you guys are looking at Utqiagvik and Nome. What's the biggest difference?
Well, there's a number. One is just topography. Utqiagvik is super flat, and there's a lot of topography out in the Seward Peninsula. And the other really big one is that Utqiagvik is really cold permafrost and really deep permafrost. And the permafrost on the Seward Peninsula is very warm, very shallow, discontinuous. And as a result, there's more vegetation. Those are, in my mind, the biggest differences.
Okay, that's good. Thank you.
Do you have other differences?
Yeah, I mean, I think we chose those two study sites because they kind of represented different points of, you know, change in the Arctic and subarctic system. And so, you know, we started out in Utqiagvik, but then moved down to the sort of more rolling hills landscape of the Seward. And so we're learning different things from these different environments. And that's, you know, our goal with the project is to eventually study and run these simulations across the whole Arctic system. So we're trying to capture those two different ends. That's kind of why we were looking at those two different study sites.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, both of you. If there's no other questions, I guess we should call it an evening. And Katrina and Bob, I know, Katrina, it's extra late for you, but if you could stay on one sec after. But for those, so thank you very much. For next week, we are not having Straight Science next week. It was going to be about avian influenza, but the Fish and Wildlife Service has unfortunately canceled that. And the next Straight Science will be August 4th. And this will be Dwayne Stevenson with NOAA Race Division. And he'll be giving us the prelim. The ships are going to be coming to Nome, the two survey vessels, and they will have just completed the Southern Bering Sea bottom trawl survey. And they will give us, as best they can, what they've seen and experienced, given that they will have just completed the survey and they will be on the first time they'll be portside. But August 4th, they will be giving us a first look at what they have found in the Southern Bering Sea. They will change out some of their crew, get, I don't know, eggs and water, and then we'll start the Northern Bering Sea bottom trawl survey. So we're really excited about that one as well, August 4th. With that, thank you all for coming.